Welcome to another video by your friend Matthew Sherling. So, I've been wanting to make a video about this for quite some time, and I'm going to start off by just kind of like freestyling a little bit. Not freestyle rapping, but freestyle talking. And then I'm going to read a few things from a document that I've put together that condenses the history of Unitarianism, Universalism, and Unitarian Universalism as a unit after the two traditions fused together in 1961. The good old 1960s. Am I right? I've been a student of the 1960s for a long time. Been a student of Christianity for a long time, a student of Buddhism for a long time, a student of history, a student of hip hop, a student of films to a certain degree, student of mysticism, a student of psychedelics, a student of various forms of spirituality. And so I grew up in a Christian family, going to a Methodist church at least once a week, all the way up till I graduated high school. And to be honest, I went to church services, I went to Sunday school, I went to Wednesday night dinner, and my parents grew up in South Georgia in a very Protestant culture and Protestant families, and so I inherited that. And when I was young, I didn't really personally think much about religion. I didn't necessarily question my religion. I never had tons of enthusiasm, though, about Christianity. I never listened that attentively in Sunday school or during services. It was just kind of like part of my life. And I didn't disbelieve, in the framework that I was given and the type of God that I was taught was the one true God, and the interpretation of Jesus that I was given growing up. But I also didn't reflect on it that much. I didn't consider the gravity of it necessarily, and then when in my first year of college, I, for various reasons, started thinking about it more, started reading the Bible really for the first time. And, I was reading the Bible pretty consistently and diligently, and I didn't necessarily start at the beginning and try to read to the end. Maybe at some point I did try to do something like that, but I was reading different books of the Bible regularly, pretty much every day. Started going to small group Bible studies, meeting other Christians around 2004, and for about 4 years, or maybe 3 to 4 years, 2004 to 2007/8, I had submerged myself in a Christian lens, and by the time 2007, 2008 rolled around, in my mind, the summer of 2007, when I turned 21, was when a shift started happening, and I took an American Transcendentalist course as an English major that summer, and I was reading Emerson and Whitman and Thoreau and Emily Dickinson, Margaret Fuller, stuff like that. And honestly, I was very captivated, especially by Emerson at the time. You know, it was just this feeling that sometimes I have gotten, and that maybe you've gotten, where you read someone and it feels like they're kind of writing from your own consciousness or something. Like, it resonates so much. It seems so true. It seems like you've felt these things or even thought these things before, but these writers are able to articulate those feelings and thoughts and maybe expand on them and express them in ways that reaffirm your own feelings and thoughts, but also take you into new territory, that sort of thing. And so around 2007-8, I read the American Romantics, and I then read some Jack Kerouac books, and the American Romantics as well as Jack Kerouac were kind of perfect bridgeways for me, because they all grew up in a Christian environment, and especially all of them grew up in a Christian environment, but Kerouac, preserved his own version of, his own Christian faith, his whole life. And I think at the end of his life, he was like painting Jesus on the cross a lot and stuff. But Kerouac introduced me to Buddhism. I mean, I had heard about Buddhism, and my brother had a brief flirtation with Buddhism a few years before that, when he was in college. So he had kind of like mentioned it to me. And I also had I have this memory of watching some weird talk on TV in high school, probably like 2003 or something. I remember hearing this speaker talk about Taoism, and I had never heard of Taoism, really. I had never heard of Taoism, but I remember really connecting with what that guy was saying on stage, and I honestly don't remember what program it was or even what channel it was, but I that was maybe my first, like one of the first seeds that was planted as far as my interest in Eastern spirituality. So, starting around 2007 and 8, started learning more about Buddhism. And then in 2008, I took a psychology of Buddhism graduate course as a graduate student at the University of West Georgia. I was an English student, but I decided to take a psychology graduate course in the psychology of Buddhism. And that was great, I mean, it taught me a lot. I remember feeling very reserved and shy in that class for some reason. Like, there were certain classes in college where I was very expressive and talkative, and I felt like I had a lot to say. But that class particularly, like, I never spoke up in class. So for some reason that, like, I wonder why that was. And I'm like sad that I didn't feel confident in that class for some reason. But it's probably because I was surrounded by psychology graduate students, and I wasn't a psychology graduate student, so I kind of felt out of my element a little bit. And, I found Alan Watts around that time. And then that class introduced me to people like Jack Kornfield and Sharon Salzberg and Thich Nhat Hanh and Chogyam Trungpa, stuff like that. And in that class, we read about the history of Buddhism, the principles of Buddhism, the practices of Buddhism, and we did different forms of meditation in class, and then we had an optional kind of secondary class that we could take where we did even more more meditation, different kinds of meditation. And I took the secondary class as well. And so I was doing a lot of meditation, and for the class I was supposed to keep a meditation journal. So I was trying to meditate every day. Sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't succeed at that, but for the most part I was meditating every day and keeping a journal. And even before that, like the year before that, in 2007, I had a friend in the psychology program at West Georgia, which actually it's a fantastic psychology program. I took several psychology classes as an undergrad and stuff, and I even considered double majoring in English and psychology. And the psychology program at West Georgia is not past tense. It still is a humanistic psychology program, and it's, one of the most acclaimed humanistic psychology programs in the country, I think, even though most people haven't heard of the University of West Georgia. But apparently, I think in the 1960s, some folks from California moved to Carrollton, Georgia, and started the program, if I remember correctly. So, a lot of the professors were brilliant. They kind of had, some of them were hippie adjacent type of people. And so I learned a lot about Buddhism in those years, and I continued my interest, and I continued reading a lot of books about Buddhism, and periodically having a meditation practice, and going to a few Buddhist spaces while I lived in the Bay Area from 2010 to 2013. And my interest in spirituality and religion was sparked in 2004, and it never really went away. I spent years and years not thinking much about Christianity, at least in any fond way, for years, and I didn't even really read, I wasn't reading any Christian books or the Bible for years. Probably from like 2010 or maybe a little bit before that, all the way up to the present day. As far as, well, I take that back. A few years ago I started reading some mystical and or progressive Christian books, because it's mystical Christian. The history of Christian mysticism is very interesting. Shouts out Meister Eckhart. he always stands in my mind as the figure that in the deep past of Christian mysticism that I have enjoyed maybe the most. And there are several others. There's a whole tradition of Christian mysticism, and these days, there's all sorts of interesting Christian writers and thinkers. Cynthia Bourgeault is one that I really like. Richard Rohr is cool. Richard Smoley, Matthew Fox, Catherine Keller, John Cobb, just to name a few. And so it's been nice the last few years, actually, kind of somewhat making peace with my Christian inheritance. And last year, it might have been the very beginning of this year or the end of last year, I can't remember at this point, I went back and I read several books of the New Testament. And honestly, I didn't enjoy it that much, to be completely frank with you. I mean, there's some parts of Genesis that are interesting, and obviously Ecclesiastes is one of my favorite books of the Old Testament. Psalms has some good stuff. Proverbs has some good stuff. Job is kind of interesting. There's some interesting material in the Old Testament, but when I was rereading it at that point recently, I wasn't really resonating with much of it. But a couple years ago, I did reread all of the Gospels, the biblical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I also read a lot of the Gnostic Gospels that were in the Nag Hammadi Library, as they call it, that was found in 1945 in Egypt in some cave, I believe. And that's got some fantastic stuff. And I had read the Gospel of Thomas, which might be the most famous text in that collection. And I think versions of that text had been found before 1945 for sure. But there's all sorts of interesting books in that Nag Hammadi Library, as they call it. The Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Thomas. Those are two of my favorites. There's a bunch, but I read a lot of those. I've read a lot of stuff from the Corpus Hermeticum. I'm interested in like the history of Hermeticism, which I think I've mentioned before on a video, and that's a whole thing. But basically my interest in spirituality has never waned, even when I was really kind of fixated on identifying as an agnostic, and a healthy dose of agnosticism, I think, is important, and I still carry that with me for sure. Kind of in like a Robert Anton Wilson way, agnostic mysticism. But at the end of the day, for one, I think that, and this is no offense to atheists, because I have a lot of atheist friends, and it works for a lot of people, but for me, atheism is, for one, like, it depends, we can define we can define sorry we can define God in a billion different ways, right? So an atheist, to me, like, has to kind of explain to me which God, which notion of God they're rejecting, if we wanted to have a dialogue about it, and I just feel like atheism is kind of boring in terms of my own adopting it. For me, feels boring. It doesn't feel, it just doesn't resonate with me, but for years and years and years, I haven't at all perceived God as some masculine entity, like a literal entity that's kind of like in the sky or something. And people talk about this all the time, right? Like, yeah. So that God, the old man with a beard in the sky, that doesn't do anything for me. And even some separate creator, however we conceive of a separate creator, that doesn't resonate with me either. So I don't view God as anything like that, personally. But I do have a strong sense of mystery. I am bewildered and in awe of the mystery of existence itself, the mystery, the fact that anything exists at all, and from my subjective experience, the fact that I exist, the fact that I find myself as this localized consciousness in the midst of an infinite universe, an infinite cosmos, a seemingly infinite cosmos, at least. And, a cosmos that has at least trillions and trillions of galaxies. And on a planet in one of those galaxies that luckily is a distance from the sun, the distance from our sun, living on a planet that produces life. Living on a planet that produces life and is the right distance from the sun to allow the type of life that we see on this planet to exist, and that allows the type of life to exist on a planet that over billions of years of evolution has produced the human being. I mean, all of that macro level history and evolution and diversity of life is astounding to me. And that's what leads me to have a sense of some sort of divinity. And again, it's not some separate, I was talking to some people last night, and I think, well, a lot of the people I was talking to in a small group last night, they were expressing how spirituality and religion just doesn't do anything for them. Any notion of God doesn't do anything for them. They have no interest in it. They think it's dumb and stupid, basically. They didn't quite put it that way, but that's essentially what they were saying. And, I mean, I was hearing them out and I was seeing where they were coming from, and I understand why they feel that way. But I was also just sad and confused, maybe, because, again, I think that most atheists have such a specific type of God that they're rejecting that they don't allow themselves to stretch their imagination to consider other notions of the divine, and the sacred. And to me, life itself is divine. Energy and matter and consciousness and organism is divine. Because it's so astoundingly baffling that it even exists. And it seems to have a creative intelligence infused in all of its expressions. And again, I'm not saying that there is a separate entity that is bestowing all of the things in the cosmos with creative intelligence. I'm just saying that there is a creative intelligence. All of the forms in the cosmos seem to be creatively intelligent. And that's wild, that cosmos can be created out of chaos, Order can be created out of chaos. Relationships can form. Interactions can take place. Plants can sense things in their environment and adjust to those and find the most effective and useful forms of behavior to allow them to thrive and to evolve. And I mean, from a subatomic particle to a human being, to me it's clear that, well, let's say from a subatomic particle to a galaxy, it's clear to me that it's, you could say, mysteriously or miraculously imbued with creative intelligence. I don't know how. I don't know. I don't know. It's hard to explain all of the implications of that, or the reasons that is the case. But it is the case. And that's part of the reason that I'm drawn to spirituality. That's more of like the macro stuff. But if we bring it down to just my personal subjective experience and our, people's subjective experience, there are things like love and care and tenderness and generosity and compassion and creativity and connection and grief and sorrow and suffering and friction and tension and anxiety and stress and depression and the wide range of the human experience and human emotions and interpersonal dynamics and desires and motivations and triumphs. obstacles. I could keep listing these things, right? But I have always found a lot of meaning and a lot of feeling in my human relationships, in my relationships with other people, whether romantic relationships or friendship relationships or family relationships, human connection. And so that reality for me, the reality of human connection, the reality of how lots of us feel moved by other people, we feel moved to connect with other people, we feel sympathetic or even empathetic toward other people, to the point where even when we watch a fictional TV show, we can cry because we feel other people. And so that side of it leads me to spirituality too. Kind of the deep meaning that emerges in our human relationships and our relationships with our environments and our relationships with other animals and even plants and stuff like that, right? So that's kind of a macro depiction as well as a kind of down-to-earth depiction. And I would say that another thing that leads me to spirituality is also, this kind of like almost, magical relationship between consciousness and the material world. And things like synchronicity, right? Deja vu, forms of like telepathy even, like having a sense of kind of intuition, I guess is a safer word for it, Intuition is almost a sixth or seventh sense that we have. And being able to kind of understand something with our whole being, without even using our conceptual minds to come to some sort of understanding or conclusion. We can just kind of know stuff sometimes, And I could give a lot of examples for that, but if you feel connected to your intuition, then you know what I'm talking about. And it doesn't have to be anything crazy far out, but just day-to-day stuff. And so those are some of the reasons that I'm continuously drawn to spirituality. And that's all some background and context to introduce the topic that I intended to talk about in this video. And now we're 34 minutes deep. I didn't plan to make such a long video, but why not? Why not? So the topic I had planned to talk about, the topic I had in mind when I pressed record, is Unitarian Universalism, right? So Unitarianism has its own tradition. And just to give you a boiled down version of the heart of that tradition as far as the past goes, is that Unitarians rejected the Trinity model in Christianity And so what came along with that is that they didn't see Jesus as God. They saw Jesus as a human being who was particularly awakened or evolved or spiritually mature, and a human being whose life and teachings we could learn a lot from and could model our own lives after. And a condensed snapshot of universalism is that it also comes from the Christian tradition, but it was unique in the sense that it was saying, well, God is too good to damn anyone. So they started rejecting hell, basically, started rejecting any sort of eternal damnation, which led to being more open to people from different religions and different, open to people who weren't religious at all. And there was a guy named Thomas Starr King in the 1800s who, very interesting guy, but he was actually a Unitarian minister and a Universalist minister. He had a famous quote, and I'll probably butcher it, but basically he said something along the lines of, Unitarians believe that people are too good to be damned by God, and Universalists believe that God is too good to damn anybody. That sort of thing, right? And by the early 20th century, both of those traditions, Unitarianism and Universalism, had become basically non-Christian centric. And each of them had a history during the 1800s, especially, of, reading texts from other religions and finding wisdom in different religious traditions outside of Christianity. And they kind of became more secular by the beginning of the 20th century. And by 1961, they decided to come together because they did have a lot of parallels. They did have a lot of similarities because, they didn't really... They focused on the positive potential of human beings, and they focused on things like social justice and, working to make the world a better place, as cheesy as that sounds, but it's true, and it's important, I think. Trying to build communities and relationships and systems that were more just and that fostered individual and collective growth, and that highlighted and cultivated our capacity for love in action, I would say, and compassion and all that sort of thing. So for me, there were years and years and years where I never considered or desired to go to any sort of church ever again in my life. But for various reasons, as an experiment, I went to a First Unitarian Church in 2018, the First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles, because it was in my neighborhood. And I enjoyed it. And it's lay-led. There's no set minister, though now we have 2 consulting ministers, a retired Progressive Methodist minister, as well as a ordained Zen priest / ordained UU minister. Ignacio Castuera is the retired Methodist minister. James Ford is the Zen priest / UU minister. and they're both great, but ultimately we have a different speaker every Sunday. You kind of never know what you're going to get. There's a lot of non-theists in the community. There are some theists, some agnostics, some people who don't even have a label for themselves like that because they don't think about theology really at all. There's a strong surge and a really fascinating history of that specific church, going back to the 1870s, I believe. Caroline Severance created the church. She was, a strong fighter for women's suffrage and abolitionism in her lifetime. She played a big part in creating the first public library in LA, as well as the first kindergarten in LA, as well as some of the first women's groups that would get together in her house and talk about important issues of the day and stuff like that. So she was a very cool woman, and throughout the 20th century that church has been active in socially engaged, love in action behavior. And at certain points in like the 50s, 60s, 70s, the congregation had gotten pretty good, and you had hundreds of people coming to each service. By the time I found it in 2018, it was very small, and it's still very small. Usually there's like 50 or 60 people online and on Zoom all together, like total, about 50 or 60 people that come to service on Sundays. And so I've been attending that church for 4 years, and it has become a huge part of my life, and I'm extremely grateful. And it was kind of a big surprise that I even went there and found it and stayed with it. And a big part of why I love it so much is the fact that it's lay-led, and the fact that they're like small group kind of discussion-based gatherings that we have, where we just talk about specific topics and in a very casual way, and everybody's very honest and open-minded and non-judgmental for the most part. And I started a writing group there a few years ago that I lead every Monday. It's on Zoom. If you want to check it out, reach out to me, matthewshirling@gmail.com. I lead some of the small group discussions on the third Thursdays of each month. I started a transcendentalist study group. All sorts of cool stuff, and since it's lay-led, like it, the members of the community, the members of the community kind of determine the character and the happenings and the everything about what's going on with the church. And I was fortunate to find it because it's kind of right up my alley, Number one, there's no dogma. There's no one holy text. It's open to theist and non-theist alike. And, kind of the thing that binds people together in the community, regardless of what their background is, are the 7 principles, the 7 UU principles. And my favorite 3, just to mention those. Number 1 is the inherent worth and dignity of each person. Number 4 is the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And number 7 is the interdependent web of which we are all a part. And stuff like that. I mean, it's just for my own feelings and worldview, it's very compatible. Another thing that I like about it is that since I am so interested in like ideas and philosophy and stuff, you kind of grounds me, you know, because it's like it's practical. It's kind of like in the world, you know, like what do we actually do to try to practice our principles, that sort of thing, which I really like. But as a way to end this video, I'm just going to read a few fascinating bits of kind of the the history of this tradition. So it's hard. There's so much, you know. There's so much. But instead of reading the bits, you can find those, you know. It might be boring to read some of these historical bits. So instead of reading those bits of the history, I'm going to just read this right here. For Unitarian Universalists, the question is never, what do you believe? But rather, what kind of person have you become? What are the fruits of your living? And that comes from the uua.org website. So, until next time, peace out.